Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles, and joining us today is Tim Jobson, who is a consultant gastroenterologist at Somerset NHS Foundation Trust in the southwest of England. Tim truly is a product of Oxbridge, having studied natural sciences at Cambridge for 3 years and then medicine at Oxford for a further 3. He went on to take a PhD in medicine from Nottingham University, and he is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. Tim is an expert in what's sometimes unglamorously known as internal medicine, and one of his specialist organs is the liver. For the past 3 or so years, Tim has been the medical director and chief investigator of a pioneering data-driven business called Predictive Health Intelligence. We first met tinkering with computers more years ago than either of us cares to remember, and I know that Tim throughout his career has been a passionate advocate for the potential of technology to improve healthcare. We'll be hearing precisely how he and his new business are doing this in our conversation today. Tim, first of all, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that kind invitation. Yeah, that's great. I'm really looking forward to this.
Now, is that a good summary of who you are and what you've done and what you do today? Is there anything that you'd like to add? Is there anything I've got spectacularly wrong?
No, that's pretty much spot on. I have morphed through various different phases of my consultant career doing other additional projects, but this is the one that's really exciting me, and this is the one that has the most potential to get the most benefit for the most number of people. And that has to be what it's all about.
Very good. Look, we'll get to that shortly. But before we get kind of down and dirty with data, I want to go a little bit beyond the CV, and I want to ask you a question that's designed to get to the heart of you. It doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about your day job. So can you tell me, Tim, first of all, how do you spend your time?
So that's a good one. And how do I actually spend my time? Because I spend too much of my time thinking. Now that might sound like a strange answer, but I do kind of not concentrate on what I'm doing and my mind tends to wander. So if I'm driving somewhere, if I'm digging the garden, if I'm cooking a meal, I'm quite often thinking about stuff. And I guess then that gets a label of you're always somewhere else, you're distracted, you're absent-minded, come on, get back in the room. So for a lot of the time I spend thinking about, projects I'm involved in, stuff I've thought of. And most of it's madcap ideas that'll go nowhere at all. And some of it's kind of ideas that everyone else has had, so that's somebody else has done it already. But it gets a little bit of a thinker. I still like to get out. I still like to get out in the fresh air. I've taken up cycling. So in lockdown, because there's far fewer articulated lorries on the A38, so I thought this is a good opportunity. So I'll go and buy a bike, but everyone else had bought all the bike. That's another good idea that I had that everyone else got to first. So everyone bought all the bikes in lockdown anyway. But yeah, I got hold of a bike and then started cycling to work because we had to still carry on working. So that's kind of my get out and about bit. And when I'm cycling, often I'm thinking as well. I'm kind of trying to generate a few more ideas and do a bit more thinking. So that's a bit of me. What else do I do? Bringing up 4 children. I've disposed of 3 now, so I've got 1 more to go. So 3 have flown the nest and 1 more to go, which is kind of time-consuming kind of game, really.
And none of them have so far become boomerangs. They're all safely launched and not coming to lodge back with you yet.
Well, the 2 at university frequently come back with some stuff to do, mainly in the form of a bag of washing or 2 and some steaks that need cooking. I don't think the oldest one is ever going to come back. He might come out for Christmas once or twice. So we'll see. There's a lot of that about. There's a lot of boomerang.
Very good. Now, look, can you, before we turn to what you're doing, particularly with Predictive Health Intelligence and looking at liver disease, can you tell our listeners a little bit about the role that data has played kind of throughout your career and most recently as a consultant gastroenterologist? Is data very important to you in the work that you do?
So yes, and yes for me personally as well, but it definitely has changed. So I qualified in medicine. It's over 30 years ago now. So 1992, it seems a long, long time ago. And the bit of medicine that I really enjoy kind of reflects the career perhaps I should have had, which was as a detective inspector. So I love piecing things together. I love I'm told reliably I want to be very good at that job, so probably I'm in the right job. But piecing together bits of information to unravel a story, to solve a crime, or to make a diagnosis is what drives me, is what's motivated me almost from day one, which is why I'm not maybe a surgeon, maybe that, the hand-eye coordination bit, but surgeons, the diagnosis is obvious. It's your skill in putting the pieces back together. If you're reassembling a broken bone or whatever, it's the treatment. If you're an oncologist, it's about getting exactly the right combination of treatments for a knowing diagnosis. That's never driven me quite the same way as absolutely no idea what's wrong with this patient. What am I going to do? How do we put the bits together? So from that perspective, I've been a bit of a data processor my entire career. But I guess the question is, where do those bits of data come from? And obviously, unless you're kind of motivated by the data that is the patient story, you're never going to do this well. You're never going to enjoy medicine. So what the patient recounts, the history as we call it, these are my symptoms. This is where it hurts is the simplest bit, but it's actually much more subtle and complex than that. And it's a big picture and it's a whole patient. So that's your kind of first data point in medicine, is all the information the patient gives you. And for a lot of people, that's of no interest. I want to see what the X-ray shows. Show me the CT scan, and we'll tell you what's wrong, and then we'll fix it, and then we've done our job. But it's actually much broader than that. So that's the first bit of data, and then you can laying on of hands, and there's a therapeutic bit of that as well, just make them feel good. And then you can see, there's a big lever there, or whatever, there's a big lump there, it's tender there. So there's more data there. But then you're starting to get into the tests, and you start to assemble those bits of information. And again, lots of people think of when we get to the testing bit of medicine, we'll take a biopsy or do a scan or do a blood test, and there's your answer. We can look up the answer, we can tell you them what's wrong with the patient. But even those very specific scientific tests, they don't actually give you an answer. They give you more data, they give you another data point, they give you a probability if you like. If you're into Bayes' theorem, this is the bit that you'll really enjoy about the increasing likelihood of one answer over another. So that's the bit that drives me. That's the thinking that I really enjoy, and then you can start to piece all bits together. And it'd be really dull if humans had been designed properly, because if they'd been designed properly, they'd have a little digital readout on the front, a bit like your dishwasher has when it says error code 24. You can go, what the hell's that? I could probably tell you it's blocked, because that's probably the only thing that goes wrong with dishwashers. But you look up error code 24, right, okay, this is a blocked pipe in the heart. This is angina, so I know what to do about that. So you can do that. But we don't have that digital readout. We don't have that system. It would have been a much better design, but would of course put us in my profession out of work. So, so it's assembling all the bits of data in an individual case that then. Yeah, that's interesting. That's exciting. But so where's it gone from there? I've done some research. So I did a PhD. That wasn't very data driven, to be honest, to start with, but I managed to push it in the data way. So that was good. We were doing cells with experiments with cells in pots and trying to find out what makes them grow and survive and then go on to do other things. And it's some basic science, but there's a data component to that. And then you've got in biological experiments, you always got so much noise, you've got to look for, is this statistically a good answer we found? And so that's a kind of data-driven part of it. And then over time, I guess things have changed more, because as a consultant, you're more responsible for a group of patients. You're responsible for a whole patch. So in our patch of West Somerset, it's not huge, 350,000 people, but there's only 3 of us with a special interest in our field. So between the 3 of us, we're kind of responsible for a much bigger proportion of patients. And some of that sits in the public health domain, and that's not what I do. But a lot of it sits in, okay, we've got that many people out there with particular conditions. We need to set up our services, configure our services to treat those patients. So that's a kind of evolution of where data comes together. And it links what's going in a population, and whether you're starting with 350,000 in West Somerset or 7 billion, which is probably some particular multiple, isn't it? But the sums are tricky with that number of noughts around the planet. that's your population. You need to make our lives a bit better if we can, and use the data and use the information to do that.
So let's think a little bit more about, let me ask you a little bit more about this area of non-alcoholic liver disease. Can you give us a sense of how big a problem this is, either in your patch or maybe in the UK, England and Wales, in terms of life lost, cost to individuals, cost to health service, cost to the nation? This challenge, which is the first that you've taken on, using your skills at Predictive Health Intelligence. How big a problem is this non-alcoholic liver disease?
So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a manifestation of the disease of our century, the 21st century. So we have evolved to spend our time scavenging for the last scraps of food, and either hunting down or being more likely to be chased by saber-toothed tigers, expending a lot of energy to survive and getting by on the minimal amount of energy. So all of our biological systems are designed to do that. But that's not how life works anymore. We've got Sainsbury's, and we've got cars, and we've got nice comfy chairs that we sit in all day. So we don't burn up any energy, and we consume lots of food. And then on top of that, we've got a whole load of other things about processing of food and types of food and all that sort of stuff. But basically, we live in a world of plenty, but we've been evolved to live in a world of not very much and a lot of stress. And the outcome of that is what we call the metabolic syndrome. And that has manifestations. So the metabolic syndrome is associated with obesity. It's associated with cardiovascular disease. It's associated with kidney problems, particularly type 2 diabetes. That's the kind of biggie, which is huge and growing problem. And part of what's going on metabolically is that when you're consuming too much of the wrong stuff and you're not burning off enough stuff, your liver stores it as fat. It's a very useful mechanism. It's something we evolved to do. And interestingly, and I'll just go into a little bit of biochemistry because this is fun and interesting, and it kind of puts a context. The liver handles, or the body handles, normal sugars and fructose, the sugar from fruits, differently. So the sugar from fruits goes almost straight into a liver cell without regulation, straight in that. And if there's too much of that, the liver will store it as fat. And when I found out that fact as an undergraduate, and it was kind of meaningless because it didn't understand the context of it, but it was a fact we had to learn that the regulation was different. So why should that be? Why should consuming too much fructose, and people have heard of the high fructose corn syrup issue, which we think in America, a huge component of a lot of their foods and drinks, particularly in North America, driving fatty liver. Hang on, how does this work? This is sugars going into liver cells. Why do we do that? Lots of theories about it, but the one I like is that it forces you to store for the winter. So the fruit comes in the autumn, you consume the fruit, and rather than burn off the excess running around with these saber-toothed tigers, you actually then have to store it away for later. So it kind of forces you to put on some fat for the winter, which means you have a modest chance of being alive come April the next year. So the liver is part of that. The problem with the liver, the fatty liver problem, is part of that excess. So fat is stored in the liver, and some of that will come from dietary fat, but it'll also come from dietary starch and sugar. So that's how you make foie gras. You feed geese too much starch, not too much fat. We feed them too much starch, and that stores in the liver as fat, and the friends like that. And it's come from sugars as well. So it's part of the normal response that then goes abnormal. So the excess fat builds up in the liver. Fat's broken down, it produces some toxins. The liver responds, doesn't like this. Hang on, we've got a problem. We'll turn on our inflammatory repair processes, starts to repair the damage. There's more damage created. Hang on, this isn't a situation the liver's designed to deal with. Better patch that up with a bit of plaster. We call it scar tissue. So it's a bit of fibrosis, scar tissue in the liver, and you get this ongoing problem, which is driven by the liver not really being designed to have that much nutrients, that much food available for it. So fatty liver disease, it's not a disease in its own right. It's a manifestation of that overall problem of excess. So how big is that problem? What does that mean? It's huge. So the rates of obesity are going up. Latest figures are, depends where you put your cut off, but around a third of the adult population are in a state of metabolic excess. So they're overweight or obese, and they've got fatty liver, and they've got emerging type 2 diabetes, or at least they're not handling sugars as well as they should. So they've got insulin resistance and glucose intolerance, and they're heading that way. So it's affecting at least a third of the population and climbing. So that's huge. And it's closely associated with those other conditions. So it's a massive public health problem, because downstream from that metabolic problem, that's when the diseases start to emerge. So the end stage of this is when you start to get full-blown diabetes, and you get heart disease, and you get renal disease-associated strokes. You also get advanced liver disease. So the sort of things that we're used to dealing with in our clinic, where people become jaundiced and go into liver failure and develop liver cancer. But that's the end stage of tens of years of metabolic excess, of too much food available in the shops.
So apart from becoming fatter, and apart from becoming maybe a bit out of breath going up and downstairs, this doesn't, in the short, medium term, cause more problems. I mean, it seems like that this is a hidden or a silent killer that is accumulating over years. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So the same with the other chronic liver diseases as well. It's going to be building up. It may not manifest itself initially in a diagnosis that we recognize from our textbooks of medicine. You've got that diagnosis, you haven't got that. You suddenly got a heart problem. You've had a heart attack. You've had a stroke. But that's the end point of many years. But there's things going on in those years. So huge problem is fatigue. These patients have fatigue. Lots of people are tired. How do we distinguish fatigue from a reversible metabolic cause from just being ground down by modern life? I think it's quite difficult, really. But so people will become immobile, people will become less productive, people will become less economically active with these conditions. And so in that lead up to that final diagnosis and lives lost situation, which I'll produce some figures for you in a second, but you're talking about the estimated economic costs alone of fatty liver disease in the UK is in the 7 to 13 billion range. Now, these numbers are generated by health economists, and there's huge, dispute about how big exactly the problem is. But that's the size of the impact of this one condition or one manifestation of that condition, where people have excess, and our lives are not designed to cope with. We're not designed to cope with our current lifestyles. So we estimate from liver disease as a totality, probably about 30,000 early deaths in the UK, 100,000 life years lost per year, if you of healthy life that's lost. Now, probably even more of that of actual, good quality life lost as well, because people have a low quality of life. And mixed into that, there's some really expensive, if you like, conditions. So there's the end stage of this, maybe someone goes with liver failure and they get a liver transplant, and that's a huge intervention. But there's also all the other things going on in these people's lives, which some people manifest a slightly different phenotype, where they've got more cardiovascular disease, so that's a huge burden there, and renal disease and so on. So it is a major problem. And the interesting thing is that liver disease does seem to be a little bit below the radar. There's a lot of talk, politically, economically, in the public sphere of the impact of heart disease and cancers and diabetes and so on. Liver disease a little bit below the waterline at the moment, I think.
So let's focus on your new venture, your latest venture, your Predictive Health Intelligence. Can you tell our listeners, our viewers, about the company, and maybe you've already demonstrated yourself as a storyteller. Tell us how you first came up with the idea for its first product.
So I think it's a fascinating journey, because it started with a change in how we looked at information, this data that tells you what's wrong with somebody. So around about 2007-ish, we started no longer looking at bits of paper with blood results, and we saw them on the screen. And I don't think that makes actually much difference to how you think about it. But there's a little button you could press that would plot a chart out. And suddenly we started looking at blood tests over time. And that probably didn't actually affect me dramatically for about 10 years. But it's obviously chipped away over time. I started to think differently. So whenever I see a patient now in clinic or go to see a ward consult, I'm looking at information over time. Hang on, they've accumulated all this damage to their liver. They had abnormal blood tests, which on any one day of the week would be meaningless. You're not going to die tomorrow. Nothing's going to go badly wrong. But the cumulative effect over 10, 20 years is really profound. So by seeing that data differently, we started to think differently about patients. And I expect most people dealing with liver disease would have started to see that differently. The next things that came along were in a quite short period of time, a number of individual patients where it was clear we've missed a trick. They've now got an advanced problem. They've now got a liver cancer, they've got end-stage liver disease, and we could have done something about it a few years ago. And then the patients start joining in with that. So the patients say, but I've had this discussion about my liver test with other doctors, with my GP. 5 years? Do you mean we could have diagnosed this? We started talking about this 7 years ago, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. I said, well, yes and no. So this isn't a mistake. This isn't like a misdiagnosis in a sense. It's a totally different way of looking at your information. But now I can chart it out. I can show you. I'm often spinning the screen around in clinic to show people what it is that I'm looking at, so they become part of that. So then we started saying, well, hang on, this is probably true for lots. And there was a seminal moment where the clinical chemist, the clinical biochemist who was in charge of our lab, sent some data to a colleague, because we were saying, we need to see these people, we need to get them into clinic. We need to get them a bit earlier. He said, you can't do that because there are so many of them. Oh, what do you mean so many? Well, we do, this was 2018 or so, we do 18,000 liver blood tests every month in Somerset in a little patch in primary care, in GP labs. So that's ignoring everything that's going on in hospital. And 2,000 of those every month are abnormal. And this equates to many thousands of individual patients each year being noted to have abnormal liver tests. So we couldn't possibly see them all in clinic. What do we do with this? So then, you see the bits of the jigsaw coming together. I'm thinking it's diagnoses that we could have made sooner. And that's very different from misdiagnoses, but it's important. It's the trends over time and the historical picture of what's been happening with these people's liver tests, their liver function tests, and a number of other blood tests. And it's the size of the problem. So we're not going to solve that. We're never going to solve that with our current processes. Our current process is, if your knee hurts, you go and see a GP. So my knee hurts, and see a physio. The physio does some exercise, doesn't work, you go back. Painkillers don't work, you get referred to a surgeon, you get a new knee, and the problem's fixed. But it started with you going to your GP with a sore knee. But the liver's asymptomatic, there's no symptoms from your liver. So you don't know. And the GP looking at one blood test can't see the picture over time. So they don't know. So who does know? So nobody really knows what's happening with this patient. But we could piece all those bits. If we could just get hold of that information, we could piece all those bits of information together. And that was really where we started with the project. We started this Somerset Liver Improvement Project to start looking at the components. What are the things we had to bring together? We had to bring some data analysis. We had to re-engineer our clinical pathways so that people could be referred in different ways. So there's a whole different work we had to do. And we had to create the capacity to see these patients. And all of that's still a work in progress. But part of that was generation of a way of looking at the data that we already had. And this is a bit that is really quite interesting, because you get a challenge at this point that says, but we can analyze data. That's not difficult. We just put the data in a big data warehouse or whatever, and we bring a few analysts who've got the skill set, and they'll give you the answer, because that's what we can do. And we said, but we don't have the capacity to do that. Getting access to the right bits of data is difficult, and it's too slow, and it's too cumbersome, and it's not something we can repeat or go back and do again and try differently and start to evolve. So we said, what we actually need to do is create a search engine that anyone can use. So We can all use search engine online. We can all buy various products. We can buy a car online or a house online. We can specify exactly what we're looking for, and we'll get a list of potential cars that you might want to buy. So, well, actually, that's too long a list. Let's narrow it down. Let's narrow the price range. Let's include a bigger engine or a smaller engine, whatever it is. You can focus in on the groups you want to. You want to be able to do that in real time with the data. And that was the concept that we came up with, that we put the data, take it out of the data warehouses and put it on the clinical team's desktop. Put it, just like lots of big companies are doing with their commercial offerings, that we're going to offer up the data in that way. And that's what we set out to do. And that's we put a group together with the right skills, I think, to do that. And then it was a matter of looking for funding, and the National Institute for Healthcare Research and HR have various programs. Some are very much focused on pure research, but others are more for innovation and so on. And so we applied for an innovation award, and that's how it came to be. And I guess the final bit of that is, okay, we set up a little company to run some of this. The main benefit of that is that we can just disconnect ourselves from the bigger NHS processes. We have to stick with the governance. We have to obey all the rules and apply for the data in the right way and ethical approval to do this work. But the rest of what we do, we can do in a way that a commercial company acts slightly differently and makes decisions in different ways and makes a lot of the relatively easy decisions much more quickly. And that's why we set up the company to do it. It enabled us to bring together much more flexibly the skills that we need to do the project. And that's why we set up in that way.
I think that sounds very smart. I think many of our listeners will know, both in the UK and also overseas, of the kind of the history of some of the slightly spectacular fails there have been with data management, unifying systems in health services and so on. So I think it sounds very, very smart to be still, obviously you're still very much involved there, but to have taken one step to the side. You mentioned a couple of things there that I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about. One is the challenges that you face ensuring that your data is clean and usable, if there are specifics there. And then the second is about ethics and the ethical considerations about how you use this personal data, I guess, on one level, and who owns it. So cleaning data and ethics of data, if you wouldn't mind.
So cleaning data, getting the data in shape, is really what we do. That's almost the main core of what our innovation is about. So we obviously, once we got, I'll come back to the ethics of the access, but once we've got through that bit and we got access to the data, some of the clinical questions I knew that we wanted to answer early on, and then we could understand what we're going to do downstream with the data. And so we actually engaged a very good data analyst. We created a secure data environment where you can log in with the appropriate credentials, but you've also got very strong anonymization of the data, so it can't be linked back to individuals and so on. And so I said, okay, can we find a signal? Can we find a relationship between these various components of longitudinal data? And this is what we published last year. And actually, because of the data cleansing issues and the data quality issues, it took quite a long time, because every time you try and get a computer program, if you like, to run against a big data set like that, it pops up an error. So, and some of those errors are important errors to understand because there's clinical meaning as to why you're getting that error. And other than them are it's just data quality. We haven't ditched the stuff that's been loaded incorrectly into the system. So we worked through that. And that was essentially a 6-month project to come up with some really good insights into what the data were telling us. And that was stuff we took and published last year as to the real power of the longitudinal data. But it also told us this is a long time. This is one of the reasons why we find it so difficult just to pay an analyst to open up the data warehouse and start finding what we need, because it's not there in a form that can be used. We now run those same algorithms and many, many millions more in about 6 seconds. So what was taking 6 months is now taking about 6 seconds. And sometimes I call it 6 seconds because sometimes it's 3 and sometimes just 10. And I think it's just a nice round number that it took us 6 months to do the work originally. And all of that improvement, there's been some great engineering by our developers who developed the system to make it run well. But most of it is exactly what you're talking about. It's about cleansing the data and storing it away, prepped for the questions we know are clinically relevant. Now, what we haven't done is narrowed that down too much. So if an analyst has their software tools, they can pretty much ask any question of the data set. It's almost an infinite number of different questions you can ask. With our system, it's not infinite, but it's still a big number. So it's not narrowed down so much that there's only one way of looking for what are you looking for. There's a huge amount of flexibility. I should calculate, there's about 10 to the 16 different ways we could express that calculation. But 10 to 16 is a long way off infinite. So we just got that, we're looking for that sweet spot between constraining what the end user could actually do with the data and making it so massive and so difficult and so untidy and you can't do anything. And that's what we're looking for. But and a lot of that is about data cleansing, and you're going to lose some. So you're going to lose some because you have to discard, if you can't identify who the patient is for that blood test, if the NHS number is corrupt, you have to delete that line. So inevitably it's a bit lossy. You lose some information in there. And if from a purist academic point of view, people start to say, whoa, how do we know that accurate? We've lost 1 to 2% of our data items here overall. And I'm saying, yeah, but there's 98% of it's good, and we can find people, and it's not a perfect way of finding people, but it's an awful lot better than we've already got. And there's a bit of pragmatism thrown in to make sure that we're not wasting that. We'll put a huge amount of effort into making it just perfect and pure from that point of view. And then you asked me about the ethics of all this, because that's where it started, and that was the most challenging bit of the project, was getting all the people who needed to agree that data access was a good idea. And we started asking all the people all the questions about the mechanisms of that, the mechanics of doing that. I had in the former life been a protocol guardian. That's usually the senior doctor in an organisation with the data ethics hat on. So kind of had some background, but even that had changed a lot. So since I'd done that role, and since then, between that role and this project, GDPR had come in. So there's a whole different kettle of fish from a legal regulatory point of view. One of the things we did start with early on, though, was our patient and public engagement group. So that's a critical part of any project like this. We have a very active group of interested members of the public and interested patients who are a voice on our shoulder, telling us what we're doing right, telling us what we're doing wrong, telling us to work harder, usually telling us to do this faster. So we put together an introductory meeting where I explained as clearly as I could what I thought the problem was, what the data would look like, and what I thought the solution might look like, and what we'd need to do with their personal, identifiable, private, secret healthcare data to find people with liver disease who'd been essentially overlooked by the system, not by an individual, but by the system. And the response there was really interesting. Because the response was, what do you mean you're not doing this already? It kind of surprised me. I was hoping to be able to persuade this group of 30 individuals who we'd bribe with a cup of tea and a car parking ticket. And actually we had some biscuits as well, so that's probably not very liver friendly, but whatever. I was expecting a hard sell, but I was hoping I was going to be able to sell it. And it was almost like, what do you mean? You should have done this ages ago. You mean there's all this data and you're not? We went to the GP, stuck out our arm and had a blood test, needle. That's painful, doc. That's painful. That hurt. And you're telling me you haven't actually acted on all the results and all the information that's in there. And that was the response we got. And that's the response we continued to get. Although it's evolved into the work harder, work faster output of every one of our public engagement groups is that, we think it's all interesting what you're doing, but you've got more to do. You've got to work. You've got to get out there and find more patients and treat more patients. So that's the ethics side of it was really helpful. Some of the pushback is also really interesting. So some of the pushback is, well, look, everyone's fat these days. You just go out, you're medicalizing the new normal. And I've had that from very respected, very senior clinicians saying, you're wasting your time here. This is medicalizing what liver disease, everyone's got it these days, so why should we worry? We'll answer because it's not good for you and we need to do something about it. So that's a pushback. There is a regulatory pushback because people get into trouble for what they do with data. And very few people get kind of praised for doing the right thing with data, for flexing the rules a bit and so on. So we knew we were never going to be able to flex the rules and bend the rules. And so there's a whole load of regulatory things that you need to go through to access the data and ultimately come up with probably the most complex and difficult to write document I've ever written, which is the impact assessment, the data protection document that you need to write for a project like this, that covers off all the potential hazards and pitfalls and the what ifs and what if that happens and stuff could go wrong. And so you've got to have a good risk assessment and you've got to have all the security controls in place. And that was another reason. So data ethics and governance then morphs into security, and that was another reason for engaging developers, a professional group, professional company, knew exactly what they're doing, who work in this space regularly, so our partners in this, who understand the healthcare landscape, the healthcare data landscape, have got all the tools for security and so on, and understand the importance of keeping this data ultra secure. And I think by demonstrating we've gone through each of those steps, we've unlocked this. But it took pretty much the first year of the project to unlock that.
It's really inspiring to hear, and I think one of the phrases that I've heard you talk about before and read about you is, this isn't you going to the doctor, it's the doctor coming to you, and in your patient and public engagement group, so encouraging to hear. Them welcoming, slightly chastising you for not having done it before, or the medical profession, the NHS, for not having done it before. But I mean, having addressed, and I know you're not working all across the country, but that may well accelerate very quickly, and may well accelerate internationally. But having applied this approach to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, I think I've got it right now, applied it to this approach, presumably there are other conditions that are the consequences, presumably not only of metabolic disease, but particularly of metabolic disease. I mean, I'm thinking of silent killers like in cardiovascular disease, in stroke, being caused by elevated cholesterol that doesn't have any kind of impact or any kind of tinge. What's next on your hit list, shall we say?
So hugely important. That's a very key question. But before quite we get to that, is all the other spectrum of liver diseases. So the fatty liver question is actually slightly harder because we've got to think very carefully about how we risk stratify and how we target treatments, and because most of the treatments are lifestyle. Now, there are emerging drugs. There's a pipeline of drugs coming through the sort of pharmaceutical pipeline, which can have a massive impact in the next 10 years. But for now, the most important thing is lifestyle. So you've got to risk stratify, and then you've got to apply that answer. So that's tricky. There are some easier liver diseases. So there's autoimmune diseases where you've got two abnormal tests. You've got this disease, and we've got a treatment, and we know it reduces the risk of transplantation. So why not do that? So that's the best example is a disease called primary biliary cholangitis. It's relatively uncommon, but we think there's probably about something between 70 to 150 missing patients in Somerset who we could diagnose, start on treatment, and for every 15 or 20 you treat, you'll save one transplant. And the numbers are so compelling for that condition, back to the data again, that you actually save money by treating patients. So people talk about saving money by saving lives, but the reality is most conditions require an input cost, and that's why the healthcare isn't free. And there's this threshold of quality adjusted life years. So the number of years that you save, how much you're allowed to spend per quality adjusted life year. So £30,000 or whatever the number is that the government come on with. And PDC is one of the few with a negative cost per quality. There's pretty good data now that suggests that you actually do genuinely save. So that's a really good example of relatively less common disease that we could treat tomorrow, but we can find the viral hepatitis, viral hep B and C, and we can find actually an interesting group that's emerging, people who should have had a hep C test but haven't. So we can get a test out to them and say, well, nothing to worry about unless, just have this one just in case, because we've got treatments now that cure Hep C. When I qualified from medical school, Hep C wasn't in the textbooks. It was called non-A, non-B. So I think there's a bit of a clue it was going to be hepatitis C. But from a disease that hadn't been characterized, the virus hadn't been isolated, that's why I didn't give it a name, but I studied the virus, through to a treatment's effective in 97% of people who take it, with no side effects. And that's a journey that's following in the study. So there's other liver diseases that we can do very easily. Well, where does this go? Well, most people with chronic kidney disease who aren't under active treatment, and that's a big number of people there, have had the relevant blood tests, just nobody's pieced it together. And so we'll probably need to do something about it. So chronic kidney disease is an obvious one. The other manifestations of the metabolic syndrome you've alluded to, so people who've got a diagnosis of early diabetes, they've got high cholesterol, those sorts of things. Anything where there is a signal in the bloods, you can find those patients really easily, as long as you know what the patterns are. And the other beauty of this tool is that it can be the basis of research and service improvement projects where we don't actually know what the best way is. But I spoke to somebody in the lab who felt that one of the particular blood disorders that they were dealing with, that might be a signal early on that you're evolving this disease, and you find it 6 months or a year ahead of time. So that's a different timescale, harder to do because people aren't having blood tests quite that frequently, but some will. So yeah, there's all sorts of possibilities. And then we can start linking in other data sets as well. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is linking in the index of multiple deprivation. So your deprivation index, are you living in a relatively low end of town or less deprived end? Because we know there's an enormous amount of data published about lack of access to healthcare if you're from a more deprived area and so on. So we can very easily target some of our interventions as well using those sorts of data sets. Why aren't we doing all this already? Question then comes up. And the answer is because it's really hard. One of the answers is really hard work analyzing all this data in big data warehouses. And what is unique about our approach is getting it out, getting the meaningful stuff out, and putting it in the hands of the people who need to use it. And that's the key link. That's what we do.
Very good. Now listen, a Columbo question for you. Is there anything I haven't asked you about the way that you work with data that you think I should have asked you? A kind of hand-on-the-door GP's question for you.
There's nothing particular. It just goes back to that thing that I was talking about at the beginning about how we look at data and how we present data to people and even to ourselves. So we all know the power of a picture, an infographic or a graph, and how you do that in your working life is really important if you're trying to convince somebody across the table or across the room from you of a particular fact, and how you present that data is really important. The observation I made is a subtly different one. It's how I changed the way I thought just by looking at my own data in a different way, and how that can be a very subtle thing over time. Probably something that's actually very difficult to control and plan for, but a really interesting observation because there's probably numerous examples of the way people have changed their approach to a problem because they've started to display the data in a regular basis, but in a different way. And I think it'd be a fascinating area of research, well beyond my capabilities, but it has huge implications for how do we present finance data or political data or economic data to ourselves, to the population, on the news and so on. Is that going to actually change the way people think about their lives and their economy and everything else? And sometimes the lack of consistency about how we present data probably is just noise in the system. It's very easy to present the data, change the axes around and be a bit manipulative at that stage. So that can then kind of create some noise in the system and make people think differently. I think it's fascinating. It's a huge insight that I've had into my own brain and how my brain works.
You're referencing visualizing things in different ways. I'll include a link in the show notes. Makes me think of an early pioneer of data visualization and data storytelling in healthcare, being one Florence Nightingale, and the way that she identified what was going on in field hospitals. Those amazing circular charts that eventually got Queen Victoria to invest quite significantly in changing healthcare practice. Now, talking of show notes, finally, Tim, where can our listeners find out about what you and what Predictive Health Intelligence are up to online, in social media? Where should they look?
In both. So we do have a website, so predictivehealthintelligence.co.uk. We pop the top now in the search engine, so you can look for us there. We're on social media, so we're on Twitter, we're on LinkedIn as well. And yeah, made some really interesting contacts and had some really interesting inquiries and things, about what we're doing through those channels. And we're very open to discussions about what we do. But I think people are really interested in this challenge, and our approach isn't the only approach. There's lots of other work going on in this space, but we do have some unique aspects of what we do.
Terrific. Listen, Tim, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing the way that you and your colleagues at Predictive Health Intelligence are using data smarter. I think if there were only more people with your open mind, your curious mind that you talk about whilst out in the country and whilst out gardening or cycling, if there are any more people with that curious and pragmatic approach, there'd be rather less malarkey about healthcare data and rather more data common sense. Tim Jobson, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.